I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Good morning. I'm Howard Husick, Vice President for Policy Research at the Manhattan Institute. Welcome to the presentation of the Institute's Center for Civic Innovation 2009 Urban Innovator Award. The Center for Civic Innovation is the urban research and reform policy proposal arm of the Institute. You can find its research and policy proposals at our website, citiesonahill.org. Its award, the Urban Innovator Award, which we present this morning, is a nonpartisan award. It's been presented for the past decade, and past recipients have included Indiana Governor Mitch Daniels, Chicago Mayor Richard Daley, New Orleans School Superintendent Paul Vallis, and Florida Governor Jeb Bush. Our award this morning goes to someone who has brought innovation and clear improvement to a big city public housing system. That combined description is so seldom applied to public housing that it bears repeating: innovation and improvement. Of course, long ago and far away, it was thought that public housing, by definition, was a great innovation and an improvement over slum housing that it was replacing, a system that would provide safe and sanitary housing to working families, a system whose rents would pay for its upkeep and maintenance. Today, public housing, unfortunately, has a different meaning for many Americans as projects known for high crime and concentrations of the very poorest households. New Yorkers are justly proud that Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor moved up from public housing in the Bronx. But that story of upper mobility from public housing has been more the exception than the norm. Not always, but too frequently, public housing projects can be bleak and isolated places where the law-abiding are cowed by the criminal, where intact families are few, and children see few role models for success. When she left behind her career as a successful corporate finance attorney, she practiced both in Atlanta and here in New York, to become Chief Executive Officer of the Atlanta Housing Authority, Renee Glover did not try to gloss over the failings of that system of 14,000 apartment units. Public housing, conceived as a reform, had become, she dared to say, a toxic environment, her phrase. And she embarked on a program of what can only be called radical change. So dramatic has that change been that today, virtually none, that's close to zero, of the Atlanta public housing projects that the authority owned and operated 20 years ago are still standing. It's important to understand, what's more, that Renee Glover deserves this award not just for having the courage to demolish aging public housing, but for the courage and imagination to envision and implement an alternative. You know, too often we think of management as something that's important in the private sector and policy as what's important in the public sector. But as the political scientist Aaron Wildowski once observed, implementation is 90% of public policy. And in Atlanta, Renee Glover has really implemented. She's done it while running the Atlanta Housing Authority very much as a business, contracting out for management services while reducing the authority's own payroll from 1,400 to 300. So resourceful has the authority been under her leadership, it's not only demolished public housing, it's charged Hollywood producers for the rights to shoot pictures of the demolition. She's the leading example, that's true. She's the leading example, but not the only one, of a new generation of public housing authority managers. And I want to recognize at that moment Michael Kelly, the executive director of the New York City Housing Authority, is with us this morning. A new generation of public housing authority managers, not just waiting for new money from Washington, but willing to experiment, replacing apartments with housing vouchers, attaching work requirements or time limits to those vouchers, replacing public housing with privately owned and managed mixed-income apartment complexes, even selling land for non-housing purposes and using the proceeds to further their housing mission. In Atlanta, during Ms. Glover's tenure, the employment rate among public housing tenants, as low as 13% in some projects, has risen above 60%. Her success in implementation is influencing policy. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, New York's own Sean Donovan, has signaled his desire to give dozens more of America's thousands of public housing authorities the same flexibility to experiment in the ways that Atlanta has. He can do so credibly because of the courage and success of Renee Glover, Chief Executive Officer of the Atlanta Housing Authority and our 2009 Urban Innovator winner, Renee Lewis Glover. Excuse us.
Well, good morning. I gave a lot of thought about the kinds of remarks I wanted to make because it's very unusual to have a group who's come to hear about this topic, and there's so much passion around the issue. So I thought that it might be helpful to talk a little bit about what got me to the place of doing the work that we've been doing in Atlanta, because so many times it's not obvious. And it really harkens back to the time when I was growing up in Jacksonville, Florida, during the Jim Crow era. And that was the time when, if you thought through it, because people were of African American heritage, the largest society at that point in time was prepared to write off generations of folks. But the difference, the main difference, and this is informed in many ways the work that I'm doing, is that we had a very strong and very strongly knitted community, and the people believed in us and believed in our possibilities. And so there was never a day that passed that we didn't hear that we were being prepared to be the next leaders of the country. So what I want to talk about this morning is how important it is to set standards and expectations and requirements of personal responsibility at the highest levels. And the way I get there is basically drawing on my faith and my own personal experiences. When I think back to the 90s in terms of the conditions that existed, they truly were unacceptable. I remember going out to one of the properties and it was referred to as Little Vietnam, not because Vietnamese people lived there, but because there were so many drugs being dealt and there were so many shootings out there that I was told that I couldn't go out there as the head of the agency. Now we had women and children and elderly persons and disabled persons living in this community, but the police officers were telling me, don't go out there without a police escort. This was the 90s. At that point in time, the city of Atlanta had more public housing per capita than any other city in America. And at that point in time, Atlanta was the most violent city in America. And as violent as Atlanta was, the properties were multiple times as violent. So for example, our first Hope 6 revitalization community, Techwood Clark Howell, had 35 times the number of violent crimes operating on that 60-acre site than the city. So if you think about that, you know, that's so fundamentally indecent. It wasn't a question about, well, do we put a better management strategy around that? What we really had to do is figure out how we were going to solve the problem. And so coming from the private sector, I prided myself coming on that I would not get pulled into the morass, but I really wanted to be strategic and I wanted to solve the problem because of the people's lives who were being impacted. And I had a different sense about it because when I saw the families who were being impacted by this terrible system, they looked like my family, like me, like so many folks that I knew and loved and cared about. So there was never a question about, do these families have the opportunity, the capacity to be successful? Because I knew that they could be if the environment got straightened out and if we set the standards and expectations at the right level. Because, by the way, the public housing families didn't trust anyone in this bargain, and nor should they have, because you can imagine standing up in front of the community telling people who are literally fearing for their lives day in and day night and day out that everything was fine. It was just a matter of, you know, getting work orders done or whatever, the kind of stuff that gets said. But they're sitting there thinking to themselves, I live here in the United States of America and I have to sleep on the floor or in a bathtub every night in order to make it. So we got together, we being the agency and the families, and said, how can we change this? And only when we started talking sense rather than nonsense did we get the buy-in from the families. So how do you go about setting standards and expectations and standards for personal responsibility in a responsible way? And I will tell you what got me there was relying on my faith. Because when I go to church most Sundays, because I'm a sinner and I'm trying to get to where I need to be, I very much value these simple notions that I hear every Sunday. All people are children of God with unlimited human potential. Not some people, not most of the people, but all people are children of God with unlimited human potential. That is such a powerful phrase because all of a sudden you realize that the work that we're all doing as a society is for God's people. And there's a whole different level of accountability when you approach the work that way as opposed to, well, what are the sort of expedient decisions that need to be made in terms of setting these standards? Because after all, you know, all of these things are so complicated. And complicated they are. But if you approach the work in terms of the standard settings and truly have faith in that notion, because that's the other thing that we hear every Sunday, is that you must believe, you must have faith in what God can do. And so the policy setting is often done by human beings, and heaven help us, we're all so human, and I include myself in this. You know, we worry, are people going to be successful? Are the standards going to get too high? Will people fail? And all of those things. And all of those statements are evidence of a lack of faith. Because if you buy into the fact that all human beings have unlimited human potential, then we need not worry whether or not God has made a mistake in creating any individual. And so our challenge, and I would say our duty, is to set the standards as high, set the expectations as high as we can. And by the way, this notion of personal responsibility, that's just not left to the people in this room or to me. That includes everyone as well. So this notion that somehow some people are responsible and others aren't is just a whole lot of malarkey. Because what we have found is when we got on the ground and started working with the families, they were so relieved to hear that we were going to be honest about things, that it was a breath of fresh air. And yes, there was some fear, naturally, but they also, on so many occasions, said, thank you for believing in us. So all of a sudden, we were into a completely different planning process because we were not planning for poor people who were incapable, who could not be responsible. We were in the process of planning for God's children. And then when we went out and spoke with the larger community about what we were going to do, we said, oh, by the way, we're not going to go about setting standards and expectations at the lowest level. We're going to set these things in a fashion and in a manner that work. So this is how we move forward. So we developed some guiding principles based on common sense, and we went to work. Our first guiding principle was ending the practice of concentrating poverty. Now, there have been thousands, probably even more than that, of research projects done on the adverse impact of concentrating poverty. This is not a statement about the families. This is a statement about a failed social design that has failed anywhere in the world. I mean, it's not just here in America. It fails wherever you concentrate the poor. Now, why does this happen? Well, it happens because the predators of the world, the drug dealers, the criminals, the bad folks, can prey on these situations because they know that they're going to be hopeless in many cases, and that they're going to be easy marks because all services follow disposable income. And so they set up shop and they dig in, and the irony in all of this, and I think this is indeed an unintended consequence, the very people that you think you're helping, the law-abiding citizens, and by the way, about 90% of the families are law-abiding citizens and don't want to be caught up in all this mess. They become victimized by the very social design. So we said, let's stop this. It hasn't worked for the last several decades, so why are we going to do a newer version of a failed strategy? So we had good buy-in there. We had some back and forth and debate and discussion, but we got there. The second guiding principle is that we wanted to bring the market to developing the housing because we defined the issue as closing the affordability gap for families who needed assistance in paying their rent. Very different discussion about creating a whole structure of housing for poor people that, perhaps can't function in the world. We knew that everyone could function in the world, and therefore we partnered with the private sector because what we wanted to do was create market rate communities with a seamless, affordable component. We were not trying to do a newer version of a failed strategy. We knew that didn't work. And everybody I talked to when I was talking about taking on this job, they said, well, Renee, I sure hope that you're not going to do what so many other people before you have done to no end. I said, no, that's not my desire because I really want to see something great happen here. So working with private sector developers and working with private sector know-how and applying private sector market principles, including the standards and expectations that come with it, along with a work requirement, everybody bought into that equation. And so when you go see the 16 or so mixed-use, mixed-income communities that have been created, the highest compliment that we get is that that does not look like public housing. And we said, well, thank you, because it's not. What we have done is work with the private sector to buy down the cost of the units that need the assistance so the families can afford the rent so that they can be mainstreamed. Because there's a saying that you have to plan with the end in mind. What we are very much about is how can we strategically help mainstream the families. And the families said back to us, by the way, please don't refer to me as a public housing resident because I am just one more resident in this community and I want to blend in and I want to take advantage of all the opportunities that are here because guess what? I want my shot at the American dream. And when we talk to the families about their aspirations, their dreams, I promise you they are no different than your aspirations and your dreams in terms of, I want my children to go to college. And one of our goals when we did our first mixed income communities, Centennial Place, is that we put into the master plan a brand new elementary school. And not an elementary school that was going to fail, but we wanted a globally competitive elementary school. Not mediocrity, you know, you can do mediocrity on any day of the week, but truly challenging the teachers, the staff, and everyone. And one of the goals was to have the students who were on assistance, if they so desired, cross the street to go to Georgia Tech, one of the finest schools in the country. And during the entire 70-year history of Techwood Clark Howell, not a single student ever crossed the street. It's just a street, literally walking across the street to go to Georgia Tech. And so that was one of our goals. And I'm happy to report that a couple of years ago, we had several students make that journey across the street. And they are on their way because we all know that education is indeed the great equalizer. Then thirdly, we look at the communities comprehensively and holistically. So this notion of mixing uses and mixing incomes is critically important. And yes, we were very fortunate in Atlanta because people were moving back into the city. Because I'm sure you're sitting there saying, well, who moved into these market rate rental units? And the fact of the matter is that because Atlanta is one of the poster children for transportation mess, because yes, it does take sometimes 2 hours to get into the city. A lot of folks said, you know what, I'm prepared to rub shoulders with folks unlike myself, and I'm going to move in and give it a shot. And so the city of Atlanta, when I started in 1994, probably had about 375,000 city of Atlanta proper population. It's now north of 500,000. So people are moving in. So there was an opportunity. So we had the opportunity to look at the quality of the schools. We have a partnership with the school system, and yes, sometimes it's a difficult partnership, but Centennial Place, which was the first elementary school that we collaborated on, is now in the top schools in the state of Georgia, and there is a waiting list. And you know, nothing drives success like success. So when people see kids going across the street to Georgia Tech, all of a sudden everybody says, well, gee, I want to buy into this. Now I'm going to ask you a question. How many people in this room, when you were looking for your first home, you were looking for that failing school in your neighborhood? Can I get a show of hands? So the point of the matter is that we know that great schools make great communities. And the families who receive assistance also know that education is the great equalizer. I mean, that's what we were taught growing up. I mean, we heard that every single day. And there was never a question as to were we going to college. It was just a matter of where are you going and how well are you going to do. It wasn't even a question about, and you heard that from everybody. Everybody that you talked to, they said, well, So where are you going? And, and that just creates a whole different sense of, self-importance and all of those things. So this standard setting and expectations setting is very, very important. And we've looked at the quality of the parks and quality of the recreational facilities, the quality of the retail, and on and on and on. And so we've had tremendous buy-in and shared vision in terms of creating these communities of opportunity so that the families can be about the business of living, learning, working, playing, raising their families. And we have not had the kind of resistance that people worried about on the front end. That's because we were honest with everyone on the front end and basically said, yes, the standards and expectations will be high. If people are not going to live by the rules, they will be put out. So I know that perhaps sounds a little bit challenging when we get into the politics of all of it. But again, if you believe in the families that you're serving, the families would set the standards that much higher. And predictably so, if you think about it, because if you had to sleep in a bathtub for the better part of a year, I suspect, and I don't know, I suspect that you would be laser focused on the kind of screening requirements and other requirements that go into the equation that make great communities great communities. When I was living here, I remember I was married at the time, we applied for, we were purchasing a co-op. And the co-op board, did once or twice or 3 times over, making sure that we were the kind of people that would be acceptable to the co-op board. So this notion of screening and that type of thing, I'm sure you folks are very familiar with here in New York. Well, the same types of standard setting has to occur in terms of, creating the housing. Maybe not the credit ratings, because when people have fewer resources, you know that there are going to be some challenges. But clearly, setting some standards where you know that a year from now, 10 years from now, whatever, the community is going to be great. And that gets us to the next principle, which is really about setting the expectations and standards. So if we know we want families to be successful, it really comes down to one or two things: education and work. I have never heard of a success story where those two things are not part of the equation. And somehow, when we engage with the families who are receiving assistance, to somehow tell them that the subsidy is going to make the difference. The subsidy is something that should help. It should not be an aspiration. And so when we got a deregulation agreement from HUD, we were able to plan at the local level to do the types of things that we knew worked based on what we learned from our mixed income community revitalization program. And so we adopted in 2004 a work requirement. And no, we're not fools. We understand that there are ups and downs in the economy. We also know that the families have to be supported. One of the things we did as a mid-course correction is that we started hiring professional coaches and counselors to work with the families to help them make the connections to the larger community and to help them with job training, education, and what have you. And all I can tell you is that that investment has been incredibly important in the success of the families. And we now have a volume of about this many success stories where people have, just gone way beyond what we had anticipated and hoped. And in fact, people have 2 and 3 jobs because now that they're into this thing, people are saying, yeah, I want to open up my own business. I want to get on with it, and so on and so forth. I want to buy my home, and on and on. That, my folks, is God's work at work. And so we were able to get our human frailties out of the way to set the expectations and standards. And so I would tell you we're on our way. Now, a few years, probably 2.5 years ago, we started having communities come to us and say, well, when are you going to get to our property? Because quite frankly, I've seen what you've done all over the city, and how about us? And so we had 10 large family communities that we had not yet treated with this mixed-use, mixed-income revitalization. And we said, well, what do you want to do? They said, well, we want out. And so with our deregulation agreement, we crafted this program that we call the Quality of Life Initiative, which basically afforded families a voucher so that they could move. And we also invested about 3 years of human development services and supported the families as they look for new homes. And so all the advocates came out of the woodworks. They said, oh, you can't do this. This is a precious resource. This is terrible, and on and on and on and on. But what they did not appreciate is that the families wanted to go. This was not a top-down type of initiative. This really was a partnership. So we sent some cards out and got votes from the families and said, do you want to stay or do you want to go? 98% of the families said, we want to go. We asked them, do you want a voucher or don't you want a voucher? 98% of the families said, I want the voucher. And the most frequently asked question in that connection is, how soon can I get my voucher so I can go? And then the last question we asked is, do you support the initiative or don't you? Again, 98%. Now the advocates, meanwhile, were out there saying, oh, this is terrible, this is a precious resource, on and on and on and on. Well, this precious resource had been underfunded for decades. All had the higher crime rates in the city. In fact, one of the communities, probably for 7 or 8 months running, there was a shooting or a murder of kids on kids in these communities almost monthly. And the families were saying to us, look, you know, we want out of this thing. And so we shared this information with HUD, and we finally got them to approve the demolition. And so the families have successfully relocated. By the way, 3 to 4 months ahead of schedule. Now, I don't know about you, that didn't sound like a bunch of folks, you know, fighting us. I think maybe there were 1 or 2 who had other agenda that they were attending to. But the fact of the matter is that all of the families recognize that environment matters. And so when we hear from them, and we do on a regular basis, they are thrilled that they were able to get out of these conditions. We had a major meeting at one of the convention centers, and the testimonies that we heard from the families would just make your heart sing. You know, people were saying, I found a great location, I'm working, my children are so proud of me because I'm working, and on and on and on and on. So, in wrapping up, I'll just say this. This whole notion of being afraid to set high standards and high expectations and expect high levels of personal responsibility, that is our problem. This is not the families who need us to do the right thing. This is uniquely our problem, because if we have faith, I promise you that we will all be amazed by what God can do. So I want to thank the Manhattan Institute so much for this recognition and this award. I'll tell you a funny story on Howard. I think he was a skeptic, to say the least, when he first came down, because I think he felt that perhaps we were blowing smoke at him, or this was a whole bunch of smoke and mirrors. But I think when he got on the ground, he recognized that this is work that all of us who are engaged with it have a tremendous amount of passion for, because we do understand what is at stake here. And so I hope that in the generations to come, the work that we dare to do will have a huge payoff, because where we will really see the change is with the children. And if we keep the children in mind, and if you think about your children trying to navigate Little Vietnam, I think that will give us both the political will and the corporate will to do what we need to do. So thank you very much. Thank you, Jim.
We've got some time for questions. Renee, if you don't mind, I'm putting my skeptic's hat back on.
Absolutely.
Draw these people into how I came to believe so recently your report. You know, here in New York, when Mayor LaGuardia cut the ribbon on public housing, and all over the country where Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt cut the ribbon on public housing, they were convinced that they were cutting the ribbon for communities that were going to last and be wonderful places to live. What gives you the confidence that you're not walking down that same road? It's a big city.
Well, everything happens in a context, and if you think about it, that was over 70 years ago. And at that point in time, that was probably the right solution for that time. And by the way, the program as envisioned was not designed to concentrate poor families. It was about clearing up shanties and slums and outdoor toilets and disease and fires and all of that. And people were expected to work. They even had a thing called a white glove test where they would go in with white gloves. I mean, so whole different era, whole different time. Unfortunately, as the years went on and there were more politically expedient decisions made, both in its conception and its development and all that, because, you know, we've gone through, you know, trying times as American citizens. I mean, certainly in the South, Jim Crow was very much a factor. And so expedient decisions got made. But here we are 70 years hence. And so I hope that innovation should be used across everything that we're doing. I mean, so I suspect that this day's solution that we came up with will probably be changed, and appropriately so, because we should always keep impact on the families and the neighborhoods in mind. And so if this is the wrong direction, then whoever is standing where I am in another 20 or 30 years, hopefully they'll keep pushing the envelope. So no criticism of Roosevelt. I just think we have to stay tethered to integrity. And I think that's around the setting the expectations and standards and understanding who we're planning for, and never lose sight of that.
Michael Myers. Oh, I should say, rules of the House apply. Keep it short.
I'm Michael Myers, the rules of the House.
I'm not directed at you.
I'm Michael Myers. I'm the executive director of the New York Civil Rights Coalition. My question to you is one of nuts and bolts in terms of what is the scale of the housing, what's the racial mix, as well as the economic mix. But what's also the enforcement procedures? I mean, it's one thing to have high expectations and high standards, but do tenants tattle on each other? Are there surveillance cameras to make sure that elevators don't become toilets? Are there procedures for evicting people? You're a religious person. I mean, I know religious families who have demon kids. And if a child, or friends, and if a child gets convicted of a crime, does that mean the family gets evicted? So what's the enforcement procedure and the legal environment for enforcing the high standards and expectations?
Well, basically, the Housing Authority has worked with the private sector. So all of these mixed income communities are owned by private owners. And the Housing Authority acts as an asset manager as it relates to the Housing Authority interests. So, for example, there subordinated loans and ground leases and regulatory agreements and what have you. We also have policies which articulate these expectations and standards, and clearly they are carried out by the owner's management agents. And so two things happen. One, everyone understands what the standards are, and there's a buy-in. Secondly, they are implemented intelligently, and underscore the intelligently, by the management agents who are managing the properties. And the reason why it's important that the private owners drive the charge is that the principals in these owner entities have guarantees, they have debt instruments and what have you. And so in order for the financing to work, most business people have to manage and mitigate their risk exposure. And so, no, there isn't tattling and this, that, and the other, but it's done at a scale at the property that there is intelligent interface. And part of this human services development is working with the families to make sure that issues like kids that are giving problems and what have you, there's some intervention in their lives to work with them. And those folks who aren't going to buy into the new equation eventually will be put out. Because if you don't enforce, and if you're inconsistent, then people don't believe you.
Yes, Tim.
Tim Ferguson with Forbes, and a bit of a follow on Michael Meyer's question. You didn't mention police presence. As everyone knows, that's been a rub in enforcement in many public housing areas. How has that worked with your program, and have you had to overcome problems with resistance?
Well, you know, the great thing about it is, which is why I made the statement that we're not trying to recreate a failed strategy. The fact of the matter is that the crime rates drop at least 90% in all of these areas. And so you don't have these artificial, man-made horror spots that you have with the concentrated poverty. So in terms of police presence, that is anticipated and addressed through the design of the community, which is why it is so important that we move away from the model of concentrating poverty, because again, you're creating these environments where the predators of the world really do take over. So by building in this market rate component, you know, things work so much better. So there's not this heavy artificial thing that you're trying to police. So it's really worked well. And what we were trying to do was design a community that would be civil and that would be decent, and that also policed itself in terms of how it operated, who was there, and what have you. Because I will tell you, there's no way, this is just my view of the world, to police effectively those areas because they are completely compromised. When I looked at the budgets, when we were managing through, as we were looking at these properties, and they indeed were managed by private sector property managers, the amount of money that we spent on security trying to combat the predictable preying on the people that went on, you know, it's just money thrown out the window, but we had to do it just to try to keep the lid on the situation until we could get to a better place.
Julia Vito Martin, Retail Planner Association. Renee, where did the bad guys go? I remember you had a lot of them, the drug dealers and the predators, and so you have your nice new communities, and where are they? Did they reconcentrate? Are there like really devastatingly bad areas of Atlanta now?
Well, you know, it's interesting. Clearly, many of the predators moved to the other public housing communities. And so that was why, quite honestly, we understood that we had to do something for the remaining family communities that existed, because we just had the convergence of a lot of bad actors, and now they just dispersed. I wish I could tell you that you can eliminate all crime, but what we were able to do is by breaking up the environments where they could pray without fear of being held accountable, they just moved on around and that type of thing.
Yes.
Well, and I work for Health Corps, and I'm from a different world, but I'm very impressed with your story, and I wanted to know if you created spaces for maybe the American, youth, teens to play and exercise, whatever, in some of these communities, because we're in high schools with full-time educators, mentors, really getting teens to take charge of their health, because we think it determines how they'll succeed in the world.
Well, the great thing is that we have a wonderful partnership with the YMCA Metro chapter, and they decided that they liked the model so much that they would do all of the fundraising to raise the capital and the operating subsidies that were needed so we could have economically integrated Ys. And so they co-programmed with the schools, because we've also been fortunate to have new elementary schools working with the school system, and then there's one charter school, so that they actually do some co-programming, because you're right, health is very, very much a part of this whole factor. We've done some research, and what we found is with people out from under the kind of trauma that they were living under, people are faring better and getting more involved in healthier exercise, and just things like having access to fresh foods and produce and what have you. So I mean, the multiplier effect is really very, very positive.
Excuse me. Name is Stanley Stern. I developed in Atlanta in the 60s and 70s with commercial, and I was convinced that planning was more important than architecture. Speak into the microphone. Oh, I was convinced that planning is much more important than architecture. And as I drive around the country, the very wealthy are in gated communities. What if we take a project where there are a dozen high-rise ugly buildings and we just demolish half of them, gate the community, put in parks, some convenience stores, and in the gated community, all visitors have to go through the gate like they do in high-income areas.
Well, we tried some of that too as we were working through. I mean, the fact of the matter is that you can't get away from the fundamental social design. And part of the strategy is to destigmatize the program. So what we didn't want are areas that were designated for the poor, and then areas that are designated for the more well-off, because then you'll end up with the same type of disconnects. And the quality of the environment is so critically important. We hired a professor of economics to do some research looking longitudinally at the impact on the families. And what we found is that the quality and makeup of the environment, moving away from this concentrated poverty model, is so essential. I'm not saying it is the end-all, be-all, but it is absolutely an essential and necessary factor. And then you have to couple it with some other things. But we tried the gating and the fencing and all of that stuff. Those are just all defensive, reactionary measures to a failed social design.
One more question. Yes, right in front. Hang on, wait.
You mentioned earlier in your talk that you had incorporated mixed income within the mixed income development in elementary school, and education is extremely important, and so is the work portion. I was just interested and curious to know as to how you incorporated the element and component of work into this, and how did the people get back on their feet and, sort of get invigorated to ultimately end up buying houses on their own and so on.
Well, it's interesting. I think the larger society really underestimates this whole notion of setting expectations and standards, because it did not take us long to get from the miserable 13% up to the 60%. I think it was just a couple of years. And so many of the families said to us, we just needed that additional push, or they needed to be able to say to their neighbors, well, things have changed, and so on and so forth. We also have invested through this coaching and counseling process, and we have a support network where we link families to jobs and job training and this type of thing. So we've been very intentional about it, and what we've seen is the families are very, very motivated. I mean, we've heard testimonies where a woman got up and said, for the first time, her children respect her. I mean, you can't imagine how powerful something like that is. I mean, and it just catches fire. And again, this goes back to human beings having unlimited human potential. And so we provided the environment, the policies, the cover, if you will, for people to say, yeah, I want my part of the American dream too. And then if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the first thing you're going to be focused on if you're getting shot at every night is, I got to be here tomorrow to even think about whether or not I'm going to go get a job, but I got to make it. So you get people out of those conditions, then all of a sudden people are much more aspirational, because they say, well, phew, now that I can make it and my kids are safe, now I can start focusing on, what my dreams and aspirations are. And I really think that that's what we have the responsibility for. When I say we, I'm talking about everybody in this room and all across America, because I do know that we can do better.
To join me in thanking our 2000.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.